So my name is Michael Rigby. I'm a consultant paediatric cardiologist at the Royal Brompton Hospital, London.
So could you tell us about memorable friends and colleagues, some of which may no longer be with us?
Jan Till has been a part of my life at the Brompton since she arrived in about 1986. She came as an SHO. I remember I was at her interview. Elliot Shineborn, with great wisdom, was able to find her some money from a drug company to give her, I think, a 2-year salary so she could do research into electrophysiology drugs, particularly flecainide. So she became an expert on flecainide, traveling around Europe, going to North America, presenting her results. And that really set her up in electrophysiology at the Brompton, and she's remained here since 1986. And she's now directing the services for paediatric cardiology. She had the wisdom as an electrophysiologist to link up with adult cardiology. And rather than being just an independent paediatric practitioner, she linked up with adult electrophysiologists because they had a lot more patients, and also they had the ideas and the new things. So she needed that stimulus, and that was so important. And she's also built up the EP department all along and still does a great job. And is a lovely colleague, I should end by saying. You know, always great to be with, good fun. Yeah, I remember when I started, the senior registrar in adult cardiology was Paul Aldershaw. The senior registrar in cardiac surgery involved in congenital heart disease was Darryl Shaw. So we are the same era. We all kind of developed together, grew up together. Paul Aldershaw, I think, has just retired from the Brompton. Darryl Shaw is still working. So they were, they were to me an important two people because we were kind of growing up together. We know the history of the organization. Another important person in my life professionally would have been Chris Lincoln. Chris Lincoln was a very, very good surgeon. He was a workaholic. I mean, he did huge amounts of operating. He's still alive at about the age of 88. I said to him a couple of years ago, Christopher, how are you? Because he rings me every 3 months on the telephone. How are you, Christopher? He said, I'm fine, thank you. Still passing urine, still walking up the stairs. And he always did have that kind of dry sense of humor. And during the whole of this journey, of course, there was my wife and children, my 3 daughters, Jessica, Olivia, and Claudia, who during the 80s, I mean, they were all born in the early 80s, so when I was working every minute that was available, I was probably neglecting them. I was neglecting my wife, Jo, who did a fantastic job in looking after the children and bringing up 3 wonderful, perfectly adjusted young women, and we're all still great friends together. We'd spend time endlessly together, singing and talking. They all like music very much, so when we're together we play and sing. But you know, they've been a very important part of my life, and they've helped me, all of them, one way or another, to over the last 40 years. And I must particularly finally recall Elliot Shineborn, great colleague, friend, mentor, organized the department from the beginning, and well, at least from the early 70s, when he was a very young man. And he put in place the building blocks for how well known and successful the paediatric cardiology department became, together with Bob Anderson. And also Christine Anderson, who was Bob's wife, very helpful to me when I was doing my MD thesis, and Yen Ho, who was very junior in that department then and is still working at the Brompton as a cardiac morphologist after all these years. So they were important and influential people in my life.
What do you recall of the management structure of the hospital when you arrived in 1979? Did management stay the same throughout the various changes?
Well, when I arrived, as there is now, there was a board of governors. The chairman of the board of governors was Sir Reginald Wilson, and there is a ward named after him. Frequent visitors will recall. And he was extremely autocratic. I found him rather arrogant, but I think he represented the hospital and the group, because we were together with the National Heart Hospital. He represented the hospital and the employees, particularly the doctors, very well, with government and everyone else. There was a hospital secretary who was the equivalent of the chief executive officer. That was John Plant. He had a deputy who I think was responsible for non-medical, non-nursing services through the hospital, and together they had a personal assistant. And then there was the consultant group, and the medical director, or as the person was then called, chairman of the medical committee, Graham Miller, would report directly and advise the secretary. And the matron would advise about nursing. She was in charge of all the nurses. Because the X-ray department was big and rather powerful, because everybody who walked through the door of the hospital had to have a chest X-ray, she was powerful and extremely difficult. You know, she was full of her own influence, but I can't remember her name now, but I remember she was Irish, but she was a real battle axe in the true sense of the word. And that was about it.
Okay. And what were the facilities available at the time?
Well, they were very limited. If we just take, for example, there was one cardiac cath laboratory. We now have 6. There was this large X-ray department. There was one echo room for limited echocardiography. Now we have echocardiography. Now we have a large echo department, and also separate echo facilities on many of the wards and on the intensive care unit. In terms of well, there's one adult cardiology ward, and one adult intensive care unit on the top floor. In paediatrics, there was one ward for children, and there was also a small 6-bedded intensive care unit, through which a lot of work went, to be honest. But it was quite an efficient system. And there were 3 operating theatres, for which there were really 3 cardiac surgeons.
And I mean, I think you've touched upon this before, but how were the medical specialties staffed and organised?
Well, briefly, in adult cardiology, they had 4 consultant cardiologists, 1 senior registrar, 1 registrar, and 2 SHOs. In paediatrics, we had 1.5 consultants, really, but also help from Graham Miller, who did some cardiac catheterization, a senior registrar, a registrar, and 3 SHOs. And in cardiac surgery, there were 3 cardiac surgeons, 1 specializing in paediatric work, who was Chris Lincoln, but he also did a lot of adult work. And each of them had their own registrar or senior registrar, and I think each of them had their own SHO.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, were there any important events or appointments in the earlier years which you could remember?
I'll tell you what for me was an important event just to begin with, because I didn't mention human resources or personnel. Jenny Jenks headed the department. She had 2 assistants who functioned as people doing everything, including all the secretarial work. Mm-hmm. So I'd been appointed. I was coming from Canada. I was already married. We didn't have all that much money. And Jenny Jenks said, well, would you like an interest-free loan to help you to buy a house? This is true. And so she offered me £15,000 in 1979 as an interest-free loan towards purchasing a house. Just imagine.
That's generous.
And this was so we were therefore able to buy a house in Chiswick for £40,000, because we sold a house in Birmingham for about £12,000 or made a little bit of profit. So that really set me up on the housing ladder, and we, I think in the end, lived in 6 houses. We kept moving. Mm-hmm. But that was an unbelievably lucky start. It doesn't happen these days. No. So other events. Well, Bob Anderson, mm-hmm. who was one of the academics in our department, a cardiac pathologist, morphologist, very academic. He was organizing a lot of meetings. So every year we'd have a couple of big meetings, national, international people coming. I had to provide some of the talks for these meetings, but we had prestigious guests who were giving talks as well. So it was a terrific training for me. Mm-hmm. To have to get involved in this and prepare my lectures. I had to learn very, very quickly. Mm. So it was important lessons in moving along very quickly, but working very hard.
And could you tell us a bit about moving to the new Brompton building in Sydney Street and merging with the National Heart Hospital?
Yeah. So remember, I arrived at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. Mm-hmm. So there we were, into the 80s. The department was expanding. Elliot Scheinbaum was very good at recruiting people from abroad to come and work as extra registrars, extra research fellows, we call them, usually funded by their own governments. Mm-hmm. And so in that period, with Elliot's kind of initial wisdom and vision, we had a couple of people who came from Brazil, mm-hmm. paid for by the Brazilian government, working with us for 1 or 2 years. Mm-hmm. One of those notable people was Julene Carvalho, and in fact I went to Brazil in 1984, and whilst I was there I interviewed her mm-hmm. with a view to coming to the Brompton, because she'd applied by letter. Mm-hmm. And it was clear right from the outset that she was talented and would fit in very well, and her English was quite good. So she then came in 1985 and stayed forever. So she's still here, So that was and she's a world-class, world-famous fetal cardiologist. Mm-hmm. And was very good at all aspects of cardiology. So that was very important. And during that time, other people came, other people that played a very important part. Just to name 1 or 2 names, Estella Horowitz, who came from Brazil, from Porto Alegre, and she organized the blossoming service in paediatric transesophageal echocardiography. We were quite ahead of our time in a way. Mm-hmm. Angelica Binotto, who contributed a lot to the clinical service. Raul Rossi, who also came from Brazil and did a lot of research in the operating theatre with Chris Lincoln. These people were relatively cheap. I think we got some soft money, perhaps from the British Heart Foundation, to help, but we had free help, as it were, which we needed because money was not easily available to appoint new people, and they helped with the clinical service.
Mm. And I understand the Queen came to open the new hospital.
Oh yes.
Do you remember that day?
Yes. So during the late 80s, during the 80s, the hospital was being built. There was quite a lot of meetings about planning, and then the hospital was finished about 1990. Mm-hmm. What I should say is before that, the National Heart Hospital, when the new hospital was built, moved to the Brompton. Mm-hmm. And so this was, remember, this was adult cardiology and adult congenital heart disease. They moved in. Mm-hmm. Jane Somerville always says that she felt and that they felt very unwelcome. She describes it as a marriage made in hell because they didn't want to come and the people at the Brompton didn't want them, and whether this was completely true, I'm not sure, but that was the feeling that they had. And Jane initially was put on the chest block with an old ward for her patients, which annoyed her very much. Eventually she moved into the new block. She had a ward named after her, or a unit named after her, the Jane Somerville Adolescent Unit, I think it was called. And the ward which she was given responsibility for was called the Paul Wood Ward. Paul Wood was one of the great pioneers of cardiology and knew a lot about congenital heart disease. He was associated with the institution, I think, in the 60s. So,
the Queen.
And then the Queen came. So then everybody was in the hospital, and then the following year, 1991, I think it was, the Queen came to open the Brompton. So at that time, I'd been made director of paediatrics. So when the Queen visited the paediatric ward, it was my responsibility to walk around the patients with her in the intensive care unit and the ward, chatting to the Queen, or her chatting to me and me answering, should I say, which was an interesting experience.
How was that experience for you? How did it?
I was nervous. I was nervous, but I didn't find it too stressful. Okay. I didn't find it too stressful, but it felt like an honor. You have to say, whoever you might be, it would feel like an honor. So. And at that time, also, things had moved on managerially. Bill Bain was the new chief executive, no longer called the hospital secretary. The chairman of the board of governors was very, very active, a great representative for the Brompton, Sir Philip Otten. He knew everybody. He knew he knew everybody they needed to know. He'd go around the hospital, visit the ward, talk to the ward sisters and the nurses and the medical staff, represented the hospital very good with the Department of Health. I don't think it was called NHS England there, but with the Department of Health. So he was an important person. And the other important thing that happened in this busy time, end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, we made one or two key appointments. In the late 80s, Michael Gatsoulis was working as a registrar in general paediatrics, firstly in Watford as a locum, and then he went to Basildon, I think, as a locum registrar. And because I did clinics in both places, I met him a few times. And he was obviously interested in cardiology, but basically his life was not going very well. He'd come from Greece, he wasn't doing very interesting jobs, and he felt rather depressed. Anyway, I said to him, Michael, why don't you come to the Brompton and do some cardiology? So initially he came for no money. But I said to him, well, someone will become ill, or we'll need a locum for people on holiday, and we'll find some money for you somewhere. And that's what happened. So after 6 weeks, we needed the locum. Michael did the locum, did the work very well. And then Another important appointment that we'd made round about the same time was Andrew Reddington, who came as a research registrar, supernumerary research registrar. Actually, he was funded partly out of cystic fibrosis money. But he had a project which wasn't working very well, so he switched on that salary to congenital heart disease, working with me and Elliot Scheinborn, and produced some fabulous research. And he became one of the important research workers, and also then working with Michael Gatsoulis. I remember subsequently Michael Gatsoulis became the head of the adult congenital heart disease service when Jane Somerville retired, and has made terrific strides. I mean, it's a department of international standing and fame, doing wonderful research work, excellent clinical work. But Michael Gatsoulis says it's all because of me bringing him to the Brompton.
And how was the merger of Brompton and Harefield received by staff and patients at the time?
Okay, so now we're going through the 90s. So we had the beginning of the 90s, the new Brompton, and then we're going through the 90s, and at the end of the 90s we've got the plan for Harefield Hospital Paediatrics to move to the Brompton, apart from maintaining an outpatient service. I think that went quite smoothly, apart from the fact that Rosemary Radley Smith was the medical director at Harefield and then became a joint medical director, Harefield and the Brompton. And so she became politically active on both sides. But Magdi Yaqub felt that the plan was to close the whole of Harefield, and this moving paediatrics was just the beginning. He suspected that the Department of Health were intending to get rid of Harefield. They had plenty of land there, the hospital was out in the countryside. So Rodney Franklin, Zdeněk Slavic, Rosemary Radley Smith were all received well at the Brompton. You know, there was a few teething problems, but there was no war. We maintained, you know, to function as a family. But Magdi was furious with Rosemary because he thought that she was betraying Harefield by throwing her weight into the Brompton, or into the Brompton merger. Anyway, what did he do? During the 90s, when he thought that Harefield was at risk, he decided to befriend important politicians. So somehow he managed to get close to Frank Dobson, who was the Minister of State for Health and whatever it's called in the new Labour government. He got close to Gordon Brown, who of course was the Chancellor spending the money, and he convinced them that what a great idea it would be to have a science park at Harefield and develop this and develop that. And suddenly money was being poured into Harefield Hospital. Some of it from private sources, which Magdi was very good at getting. And of course the government were happy to partially fund things if they'd been partially funded from other sources. So that really ensured the future of Harefield for adult work, and of course it's a very busy hospital. There's just one other thing that I should say, because also in this busy period, around about 1998, 1999, Andrew Reddington, who'd had a decade of working at the Brompton and research, and Bob Anderson, who'd also had a decade of research, international fame, organizing meetings, and suddenly were poached by Great Ormond Street. And overnight they announced they were both going to Great Ormond Street Hospital. So this was a huge shock for us, because they were part of the Brompton family, and to us it seemed a big loss, clinically, research-wise. So this upset us a lot. They were considered traitors, really. You know, people were calling them traitors. And anyway, So they disappeared. But Andrew Reddington subsequently, and Bob Anderson, but Andrew Reddington, who I speak to every so often, occasionally meet socially. He's living now in the United States in Cincinnati. Mm. But he always says that the happiest time of his professional life was his decade at the Brompton Hospital. Happiest, probably most productive. Mm. But in reality, he wanted to make money. And eventually, after 2 years at Great Ormond Street, where he wasn't all that well received, he went to Toronto for at least a decade or 12 or 13 years, and now is in Cincinnati. Mm. But I'm always reminded of a song written by Howard Greenfield and Neil Sedaka. Mm. And the bridge of the song begins, "I miss the hungry years." I miss the hungry year, the once upon a time, the lovely long ago, I didn't have a dime. And that really applies to Andrew Reddington, because he misses the hungry years when he was here, but he wanted to be more successful and make at least money-wise, and he left. So, and Bob Anderson also, I think, had a great time here. So the grass is not always greener on the other side.
Yeah. And did the congenital cardiac services continue to expand and develop after the 2000?
Yes, they did. They did. I mean, we had, we had obviously an addition of 3 experienced consultants, but then we were joined at this time of the divorce from Reddington and Bob Anderson by Piers Daubeny, who was a new, young, dynamic paediatric cardiologist who'd been working in Southampton and then in Melbourne, a very good department in Australia. Mm-hmm. So he joined us in 1999. Rosemary Radley Smith probably retired in about 2005, but we continued to make important appointments. In 2010, Alain Frey came from Marseille, and he's still with us, and he's really leading the service in congenital heart disease, and enjoying himself here. We had Anselm Ubing, who came from Germany to work in adult congenital heart disease, a great friend of mine. He spent a decade here from 2010 to 2009 to 2019. Mm-hmm. Also played the piano for me in the Christmas show sometimes. Her name is Claire, she loves the boys, and Redding's Cross, her special choice. I'll tell you, buddy, she made a study of making whoopee. Oh, darling Claire. Yes, so the development and the expansion continued, and then we also made other important appointments, particularly in fetal cardiology. We had Margarita Bartsota, who was a real star in terms of being a cardiologist and a fetal cardiologist. She was at the beginning of that decade, beginning 2010. Nikki Jowett, also a fetal cardiologist, and some other very good people. So we've continued to progress and replace the older people with the younger people and what have you.
And can you draw any parallels from the Brompton's history to the most recent GSCT merger? I mean, what are your thoughts on this merger?
So, you remember Jane Somerville said, "We didn't want to join you and you didn't want us." Mm-hmm. So there is still the same feeling with regarding Geisens and Thompsons. I mean, they're not thinking, "Isn't this fantastic? Mike Rigby's now part of our group." Partly because I don't know most of the people, hardly at all there. I know 2 people quite well, but apart from that. And are most of the people in our department at the Brompton in paediatric cardiology and really full of enthusiasm about going? Not at the moment. But there is good progress being made. There are groups meeting, but you can't suddenly throw two families together and expect overnight they're going to be partying every weekend. It takes quite a long time to establish relationships. And the same was true when the Heart Hospital merged with the Brompton. So it's going to take time. It's stupid to pretend that everybody thinks this is wonderful. It is true that everybody is working at getting the two families together and doing things jointly and seeing what progress can be made, but it's not being done with huge enthusiasm, but nevertheless with an acceptance that it has to happen and eventually it will work. You know, you're reminded of that song, which was, I think it was written by, I think, Rodgers and Hart, called You'll Never Walk Alone. You know, when you walk through a storm, hold your head up high and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of the storm is a golden sky and the sweet silver song of a lark. And I think this would be the hope. You know, it's going to be a struggle. You go through the storm and the unhappiness, but eventually things will work out well. I think I've said enough, haven't I?